The desert had its own way of holding on to September. Even after the sun dropped, heat stayed clamped to the earth like glass pressed over a flame. At 7 p.m., Mason Reed steered his silver sedan beneath the sign for the Dusty Spur Motel in Beatty, Nevada. Two tired palm trees threw shaky shadows against corrugated metal siding. The only sound was the rattling cough of the ice machine and the buzz of a sodium light that painted the lot in orange haze. Inside the office, Irene Voigt slid a register across the counter. The book was cracked at the spine, pages smudged with years of sweat and road dust. She handed Mason a plastic key sleeve and a cheap motel pen, the kind with blue ink that always seemed to bleed. His name dragged across the page in uneven strokes, the last entry before the lines turned blank. Irene asked if he wanted ice. Mason shook his head politely, lifted a canvas camera bag from the floor, and disappeared into the heat-dimmed hallway without another word. He spent that night sitting on the concrete step outside his room. Trucks groaned along US 95 in the distance, their tail lights like embers drifting through the dark. Mason unrolled a stained oilcloth map across his knees. The map was old, corners softened from years of folding, its surface carrying the faint smell of machine grease. With a black marker, he drew a small circle over a dry wash etched between two anonymous ridgelines. He pressed hard enough that the ink bled through the map and into the motel stationery underneath. The room behind him remained untouched. Bedspread smooth, air conditioner clicking in the wall, a TV muted in the corner. Mason drank bottled water, capped his pen, and tucked the map back into his bag. The next morning was already hot by 10:45 a.m. when he stepped into a gas station on the edge of town. Alma Ruiz stood behind the counter, stacking bags of ice. Mason laid down 2-gallon bottles of water and a pair of protein bars. He asked if the wash he'd circled ever held standing water. Alma laughed softly, said not unless a storm rolled through, which was rare. She remembered his tone later, less like a casual traveler, more like someone confirming coordinates on a chart. She rang up his purchase, watched him slide the receipt into his pocket, and walk out into the blinding light. At 11:15 a.m., a security camera bolted above the motel office caught a fleeting frame of Mason's sedan pulling away. The angle was poor, the desert glare bleaching out the license plate, but the shadow of a flagpole across his hood confirmed the direction, north, toward dirt roads that branched away into silence. By evening, his absence was noticed. A maid knocked twice on his door. No answer. She turned the key, pushed the door open, and found the bed unslept, blinds closed, air conditioner still humming. On the desk lay the oilcloth map, unfolded. A motel pen rested along its crease, ink pooled at the tip where the ball had stuck. Next to it was the folded gas station receipt, time-stamped 10:45 a.m. And on a scrap of motel stationery, one word was written in block letters, wash. Irene Voigt called the Nye County Sheriff's Office just after 8 p.m. Deputy Kara Sloan arrived before midnight, headlights sweeping the lot. She studied the room in silence. The map smelled faintly of oil. The circle Mason had drawn was dark, precise. Kara noted the receipt, bagged the motel pen, and called Ranger Dale Kincaid to alert him of a possible missing camper. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked disturbed. The room carried the stillness of a plan interrupted. By mid-morning, a ranger patrol reported finding a tent pitched half a mile off a dry wash. The desert was cruelly bright, each stone casting its own shadow. The tent flapped in the hot wind, one stake pulled loose. Inside, a thin jacket was folded neatly over a camp chair. An air mattress sagged in one corner. 2 empty water bottles lay on the floor. But Mason's camera bag, wallet, and phone were gone. Deputy Sloan crouched at the entrance. The sand outside showed shallow shoe impressions trailing toward the wash. Then the prints ended abruptly, scoured by wind. She shielded her eyes with one hand, scanning the ridgelines above. The view was commanding. Anyone positioned there could have watched the camp all day, unseen. Searchers arrived by afternoon, local volunteers, a few ranch hands, a pair of off-duty firefighters. They divided the terrain into grids, marked sagebrush with flags, and moved slowly, eyes fixed on the ground. The sun punished every movement. One man reminded others to sip water at regular intervals. Another warned against walking the wash banks. They collapsed easily, hiding what fell into them. Sloane logged the contents of the tent. She sealed the motel pen in a plastic bag, labeled it. She folded the oilcloth map and placed it inside a cardboard evidence sleeve. The circle Mason had drawn was still there, bold and black. The word wash on the motel notepaper sat beneath it, smudged at the corner where a thumb had pressed. The volunteers fanned outward. One noticed a faint drag line in the sand, barely visible, threading away from the tent. It extended several yards before vanishing on harder ground. No explanation. No conclusion. Just a line that ended where the earth offered nothing further. By dusk, the camp stood as it had been found, door lifted by the wind, walls glowing faintly in the low light. The desert, as always, reclaimed the edges. The tent stood silent, door lifted by a restless wind. The morning after the tent was found, the air was already over 100 degrees by 9 a.m. Heat pressed against the patrol trucks, paintwork shimmering, tires groaning as if the desert was trying to pull them down. Ranger Dale Kincaid stood with his arms folded, staring at the nylon structure pitched beside the wash. To him it looked like a lantern turned inside out, pale walls glowing in the sun, the door cut open and trembling against its stakes. Deputy Kara Sloane walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching. She measured the ordinary before she could trust the strange. The tent was zipped half down, fabric caught where a tooth had skipped on the line. Inside, one jacket, a mattress leaking air, 2 empty bottles lined near the flap. Nothing else. No camera, no wallet, no food bag, no phone. The sand outside showed shallow boot impressions. They led a short way toward the wash, then stopped. Beyond that, nothing but wind scoring the earth flat. By 10 a.m., volunteers arrived. Some had worked search and rescue before, others were ranchers who knew how to read ground. They carried with stakes and colored surveyors' flags. Kincaid showed them how to grid, 15 yards between lines, eyes scanning for irregular shapes, for anything that broke the natural rhythm. Each man or woman walked slow, flags snapping in the heat. Their shadows shortened until they looked pinned to their boots. A mile out, the land buckled into ridges. From there, one could see straight down into the wash where Mason's tent stood. Kara raised binoculars. The view chilled her more than the sun ever could. Whoever had been there, if anyone had, would have had full command of the scene below. Back near the tent, Kincaid crouched low. His hand hovered just above a faint trail, a drag line etched in the dust. It stretched nearly 20 feet, shallow at first, then deeper, before breaking off where rock interrupted. He called Sloane over. They followed the line until it disappeared, both of them silent, unwilling to state what it suggested. On the ground beside the trail lay a thin nylon thread, black, caught on a thorn of desert scrub. Sloane pinched it carefully with tweezers, dropped it into a paper envelope, and wrote the time in block letters. Closer to the wash, a second discovery, a partial tire track. Not the smooth arc of highway rubber but the blocky pattern of all-terrain tread. The imprint was shallow, laid over older scuffs. Sloane bent down, photographing it. The sun made her shadow swallow the track as though even the evidence refused to stay visible for long. By noon, the grid search turned up little else. No footprints beyond the short trail from the tent. No dropped gear. No clothing. Just one broken branch where something heavy had leaned, and the drag mark ending in silence. The volunteers broke for water, faces reddened, shirts clinging dark at the shoulders. A few muttered theories, maybe heat stroke, maybe Mason wandered off delirious, maybe coyotes. But coyotes left trails, left bones. Nothing here suggested that. Sloane sat on the tailgate of her cruiser, jotting notes. She took the motel pen from its evidence bag and held it in her hand for a moment. The cheap barrel was cloudy, scratched from years in drawers. Ink smudged at its tip like blood clotting at a wound. She imagined Mason pocketing it absent-mindedly, carrying a piece of the motel with him. Now the pen was the only item linking his presence in town to this strip of desert. The oilcloth map had already been bagged, sealed with tape. Its crease still smelled of machine grease. The circle Mason drew was bold, an orbit around emptiness. By late afternoon the search lines pulled back. Volunteers staggered, voices hoarse. The desert gave them nothing else. Kincaid made a note to widen the search in the morning, but even as he wrote it, he knew wind would undo their work overnight. As the last trucks pulled away, Sloane lingered. She stood in the doorway of the tent, staring into its hollow glow. Nylon walls flickered pale yellow as the sun tilted. A jacket sleeve lifted in the breeze, rising as if a hand still filled it. Outside, the drag line ended where the ground turned hard, as though the desert itself had swallowed the rest. When the wind shifted, it caught the edge of a tire impression and blurred the block pattern into powder. Sloane looked once, then twice, as the mark dissolved into the sameness of sand. She closed her notebook, stepped back, and let the tent stand alone in the fading light. A single tire track cut across the sand, then vanished. By dawn on the third day, the tent still stood by the wash, a ghostly marker the searchers now worked around. The desert was relentless, stripping details the way wind scours paint from metal. Beatty woke to the same routines, trucks idling at gas pumps, the smell of burnt coffee drifting from the diner, the long silence between passing cars on Main Street. But the motel room where Mason Reed had checked in remained untouched, his key still hanging on the wall behind Irene Voigt's desk. Deputy Kara Sloane began her canvass in town. She started with the dusty Spur Motel, taking Irene's statement in the dim office where the ice machine rattled again. Irene repeated what she knew, a polite man, camera bag, one night stay. No calls from the room, no guests seen with him. Kara jotted notes with her department pen, but her eyes lingered on the motel pen sealed in plastic, its ink smear frozen like a small wound. At the gas station, Alma Ruiz remembered him clearly. She told Kara how Mason asked about standing water, how he bought protein bars like someone stocking for a trek, not just a scenic walk. Alma pointed to the receipt book where his purchase time matched the one on the slip found in his room, 10:45 a.m. Sloane photographed the entry, thanked her, and asked about traffic that morning. Alma shrugged. Tourists heading north. Local pickups carrying hay. Nothing stood out. Later that afternoon, Sloane found herself at the edge of a scrap yard south of town. Cody Bell leaned against the chain-link fence, shirt faded, eyes narrowed from years of desert sun. He was known to drift, picking up odd jobs, sleeping where he could. When asked if he'd seen anything unusual near the wash, Cody squinted, spat, and said he'd seen a pale pickup parked wrong just after 4 p.m. that day. It wasn't locals, he muttered. Locals don't sit in the sun with engines off. Kara pressed for more. Cody only shook his head. He didn't see faces. Didn't want to. But he remembered the truck's position, nose pointed toward the wash, wheels angled as if ready to leave fast. That account, thin as it was, shaped the next phase of the search. Outsiders came through Beatty every week, tourists, workers, truckers, but few stopped long enough to mark memory. A pickup parked near a wash could be nothing. Or it could be everything. Back near the tent site, Sloane and Ranger Kincaid walked the perimeter again. They noticed something overlooked, a faint dark patch on the dirt, small but distinct. When Kincaid crouched, the smell rose immediately, gear oil, sharp and acrid, soaking into the soil. He scraped a sample into a vial, noting the location. Nearby, a shard of glass glinted under the sun. When turned, it showed backing from a reflective surface, like a broken piece of a side mirror. The desert was a mechanic that took its time. Oil would spread until sand absorbed it, glass would weather to dull edges, but for now they were fresh. Sloane bagged both items. She didn't say it aloud, but her notes used the word vehicle. Not pickup, not suspect. Just the neutral shape of possibility. At the sheriff's substation, the objects lined up: a motel pen, an oilcloth map, an empty tent, a drag line, now oil and glass. The evidence board began to look less like a mystery and more like a map of absence. That evening, Sloane spread the oilcloth map across her desk. The circle Mason had drawn sat heavy on the page. With her own marker, she drew an arrow from the circle to the patch of ground where the oil stain had been found. The arrow looked out of place, a human attempt to create logic in terrain that thrived on erasure. Back in town, Cody nursed a beer on the porch of the scrapyard office. He didn't talk further, but when asked later, Irene recalled how he muttered something under his breath, about hunters who didn't hunt animals. Words carried by wind, dismissed as the ramblings of a drifter. But they settled into the background like grit in a shoe. As darkness fell, Beatty returned to its routines. Neon signs hummed, gas pumps clicked, families locked their doors. Out in the desert, the tent remained by the wash, its walls glowing faint in moonlight, like a lantern waiting for someone to come back. The oilcloth map lay folded in evidence, ink circle now paired with a black arrow. The map closed, grease bleeding into its crease. Dawn slid in thin and colorless, the kind of light that had more temperature than hue. The tent still marked the wash like a wayward milepost. Beyond it, the land rose in quiet folds toward a ridge made of stacked stone, jagged as teeth. The place offered a vantage point no fence or sign could control. It watched without moving. The search leader called for a smaller team that morning, not to cover distance but to learn shape. They walked the slope in a slow zipper, right to left to right, pausing whenever the ground changed its mind. A rabbit scissored through brittlebush and vanished. Far out, a truck drew a pale chalk line across the highway and was gone. From near the crest, the tent looked arranged, not abandoned. If you set a chair on that ridge and someone sat still, the canvas below would open like a diagram. The wash curve, the entry flap, the short run of footprints, visible when the sun was just so. One step back and all of it dissolved into texture. Kara took her time. She moved with the care of someone reading a name carved into weathered wood. Off to the right, a natural path threaded between two rock ribs. It dropped to a blind pocket, a shallow bowl that let heat pool and sound fall away. From there, the tent would be close, the wash closer, and the highway distant enough to be theoretical. She crouched where the dust held on to evidence a little longer than it should. A set of boot marks climbed toward the pocket. Not the faint steps they'd been following for 2 days, but heavier, planted. The stride was short, turned slightly toe out, the way a man carries weight he's used to. The trail moved opposite the wind's recent direction, meaning the prints had been made after the gusts that rubbed the first tracks down. That suggested order. It did not suggest kindness. They followed in silence. The marks veered toward a stand of cholla and stopped where the ground tipped into the pocket. 100 tiny barbs waited at the cactus edge like pins. One thorn gripped something that didn't belong, a thin brown thread, wedged where the spine narrowed. Kara eased it free with tweezers and folded it into paper. She wrote the time, the location, the simplest words only. Below them, the wash lay exposed. A line of pale gravel held no memory of rain. What the basin remembered were the things the wind forgot to carry: ripples, seeds, light trash flattened into anonymous shapes. The drag mark from the tent pointed this way, like a sentence ending mid-phrase. Everyone saw that. No one said the quiet part. They climbed out and angled along the ridge to check the other side. Between two boulders, a seat of scraped stone faced the tent. On the rock, a flattened spot with black flecks that could have been windblown ash, or just the leftovers of weather doing its work. Nothing to seize, nothing to name. The view, though, did the talking. The tent door was a mouth. The wash a throat. The highway, a straight line that never looked back. Back in town, word moved like it always did, through the diner, past the laundromat, across two barstools no one claimed. Stories of campers losing coolers the previous summer showed up uninvited. Someone's lantern gone from a site off the county road, someone else's toolbox lifted from a bedliner while they checked a map. Small thefts, the kind that fill a deputy's week without ever making a case. They didn't look like a path until you laid them over the ridge and the pocket and the tent door drawn like a target. At the motel, Irene kept the room key pinned to the corkboard and the ledger open to the last page. She said she liked knowing where the story stopped making sense. The oilcloth map had been handed over, sealed, and logged, but she kept a photocopy under the counter. When truckers asked for directions, she slid it out and tapped the circle without meaning to. Every time, her finger found the exact spot, the grease-dark crease, and the paper shivered beneath her nail. That afternoon, Kara spread the photocopy on the hood of her cruiser and inked a thin triangle, tent to ridge to pocket. She didn't draw a fourth point. The motel pen had run dry the night before, giving up in a scratch of air at the edge of her notes. She turned it end over end in her fingers and put it back in its bag. The felt marker she used now left a soundless line, too smooth for the grit it described. They returned to the ridge at 4 p.m., when heat bunched near the ground and the sky bleached. From the pocket floor, voices from above arrived late, as if the air needed time to make up its mind about what to carry. A volunteer tried standing where a man might wait. He saw how the tent door aligned with a patch of shade thrown by a low mesquite. If someone spoke from there, the person at the tent would look into shadow to answer. A small advantage tied to sun and habit. Kara stepped the last yards from the pocket down to the wash, counting without counting. Her boots pressed half-moons into the sloped shoulder, prints that already frayed at the edges. Standing where the drag line quit, she studied the reach between disturbed and undisturbed ground. 12 feet? 15. The gap had a shape she'd seen before, the place where something transitions from evidence to story. Which is to say, the place where an investigator starts performing subtraction. On the way back, they took the long line along the ridge crown, scanning for a clean tire impression, a spent casing, a dropped battery cap, anything that chose to be heavier than wind for a little while. A raven clacked and rock-hopped parallel to them, annoyed or curious, it was hard to tell. Someone called out that they'd found the ghost of a fire ring, an oval of stones tucked tight under an overhang. The interior was empty. The desert had eaten the things fire leaves last. Or there had never been a fire at all and stones simply done what stones do, answer gravity. They regrouped at the trucks with their faces sanded raw. The sheriff's maps were spread across a tailgate, the oilcloth copy weighed down by a wrench and a half-full jug. The circle had started to look like an invitation. Or a dare. The triangle Kara drew made it worse. 3 points argued for intention, not accident. Night fell early over the ridge, though the highway kept its own hours. The tent glowed and dimmed as the wind worried its walls. Somewhere out there, the pocket cooled slow, surrendering heat like a hand unclenching. Town lights clicked on one storefront at a time. At the motel, Irene locked the office and turned the ledger so the last entry faced down. She didn't want the emptiness looking up at her after close. In the substation, the evidence shelf held small things pretending they mattered, a pen that no longer wrote, a paper envelope with a brown thread, a photograph of a boot path heavier than the others. Each object made sense by itself. Together they suggested a method you could not arrest. The ridge kept its seat, facing the tent like a judge facing an empty chair. The wind shifted and laid every blade of desert grass in one direction, as if pointing. Then it shifted again and pointed somewhere else. Then the wind erased even the idea of a path. By the fifth day, the tent no longer looked like a place to sleep. It looked like a display, items spaced in an arrangement the desert barely tolerated. The jacket still folded on the chair. The air mattress sank a little more. The zipper hung at the same snag. Nothing had moved except the sand trying to make everything agree with itself again. Deputy Kara Sloan worked the interior with the patience of someone who understood that answers sometimes hid in small rudenesses, a cap set down off-center, a wrapper folded too neat. She laid a sheet of butcher paper on the ground just outside the flap and began transferring objects one by one. Not much to transfer. A couple of wrappers. An empty stove bag. The two plastic bottles with their mouths turned up like faces watching weather. She wore powder-free gloves, not because she expected a miracle, but because people who stopped expecting them didn't find anything at all. The notebook surprised her. It was the size of a pocket, leatherette peeling at the spine, elastic band loosened into limp string. Not a journal so much as a list maker. The first pages held small square notes in tidy block letters, mile markers, the names of abandoned mines, reminders to charge batteries, a sketch of a crooked sign he wanted to photograph. Midway through, the tone tilted, short arrows pointing between two nameless ridges, a box around a wash line that the map already knew. Near the back, a page had been torn. Not cut. Torn. Kara could see the ragged teeth where paper surrendered to a fast decision. The next page was blank. She felt the empty weight of it as surely as if she held a stone. Outside, the sun did its work. A dragonfly stitched the same path between two shrubs. A volunteer poured water over his head and blinked at the salt in his eyes. Ranger Dale Kincaid kept the loop small, working a tight circle around the tent and nothing more. He didn't want to build distance into the story until the story asked for it. Back at the substation, the evidence room smelled like cardboard and copy toner. On a steel table, the motel pen lay in its clear bag, inert and cloudy, the way some evidence looks like it stopped being real the moment someone wrote "evidence" on it. Next to it, the oilcloth map, folded and sleeved. The circle was visible even through plastic, a black ring around a piece of topography that looked like any other until it didn't. Kara logged the notebook, then hesitated. She turned it so the torn place faced her and took a photograph that wasn't for the case file. It was for the kind of memory that argued later with doubts. You could talk yourself out of what a torn page meant if you didn't keep an image of its edges. She bagged it and printed the number on the seal with block letters you could read from across a room. She returned to the tent with a small kit she'd collected over years of scenes that didn't become cases. On the butcher paper, she unscrewed the cap from one of the empty bottles. The knurling bit her glove lightly. The sun beat on her neck. She held her breath to steady her hands and dusted the cap's interior with a whisper of powder. It wasn't drama, just quiet habit. A pale crescent bloomed where a thumb might naturally press. Not whole. Not enough to headline anything. But a partial that chose to exist under heat and time. She photographed it in place, then lifted it with tape and trapped the relief on a white card. For a moment the world narrowed to plastic, print, card. Then the heat swept back in and widened everything again. That was one touch of science, almost a courtesy. The rest of the tent insisted on being narrative. The mattress sink wasn't a measurement. The jacket fold wasn't a confession. She kept the pieces anyway, because small honesty sometimes helps when bigger lies arrive. At the wash's edge, she stood where the drag mark had become sentence fragment. She let her gaze lower to the ground just past the last disturbed grains. There, in the place everyone assumed empty, a shape surfaced only when light hit it sideways, a bare footprint flattened by time and half filled by dust. Not a clear heel-to-toe gift. Just the suggestive negative of a foot. The arch and toes had a roundness that boots didn't pretend to. She measured it loosely, longer than the shoe size listed on the motel register form, or what she would have guessed from his boots at check-in. Different in length, different in width, different in the kind of pressure that made it. She marked the edges with thin flags 2 feet apart, not because flags matter to wind, but because humans need signs to talk to each other. The sight of human skin on ground, even as absence, shifted the air. Volunteers came close, then backed away in a wordless arc, letting the space breathe. Kincaid said nothing. He just watched the shadow crawl as the sun moved, as if time itself was giving the print a last outline before reclaiming it. In town, the diner kept refilling coffee that tasted like it had been on since dawn. Irene Voigt, behind her counter, told a traveler where the good pie used to be and stopped herself from pointing to the circle on the photocopied map she kept under the till. People asked for directions the way they always did. The map remained a ritual more than a tool. But she felt it tug like a string around her finger. The place where grease had soaked the fold left a darkness she couldn't forget even with her eyes closed. The outsider in this story, the one who stitched the weeks into a line, stacked the artifacts on a desk not in order of importance but in order of silence. The oilcloth map went first. It had become a kind of metronome, open, fold, open. The motel pen next, useless now, but a connection between lobby and sand. Then the notebook, elastic band limp, gap where the page had been. After that, the bottle cap card with a partial print that would play no roles but might anchor an argument against forgetting. Every case had items like this, things that took the air out of a room without changing its shape. Theories had their turn, as they always did. Heat takes judgment. People get disoriented and walk exactly the wrong way. Predators prefer cover and routine and choose ground that makes other people doubt. One theory had the decency to be simple: he left the tent, saw something at the wash, stepped toward it, and the rest of the story was written by someone who liked corners, places where line of sight broke and sound skidded to a stop. Late afternoon slid in, dulling color. Kara stepped back into the tent and let her eyes adjust. The nylon walls warmed the light until it looked almost kind. She checked the chair pocket and found a crumpled grocery slip from the day before he left: 2 waters, 2 bars, nothing else. She added it to a small envelope and wrote the time. The list meant thrift or habit or nothing. She read it anyway on the table outside, as if the prices might confess something the objects refused to. At 5 p.m., the wind rose, lifting a curtain of powder off the wash and draping it over prints and intentions alike. Flags leaned in one direction, then another, agreeing with whoever spoke last. Kara sealed her kits, closed the tent flap halfway, and stood with her hand on the line, feeling the buzz of nylon against her palm. Then she let it go. The flap trembled, then settled, like an exhale someone tried to hide. On her way back to the trucks, she paused where the notebook had come out of her bag hours earlier. She looked at the torn place in her mind one more time. People tear out pages for many reasons. The desert usually supplies one more. The missing page belonged to someone's story. It no longer belonged to paper. A torn page waited in the heat. By the 6th day, the story tried to write its own shortcut. People liked answers with a single verb. Lost. Wandered. Fell. Heat stroke worked well because the desert volunteered as co-author. A body grows lightheaded, walks toward shimmer, collapses in a place no one looks. It could happen to anyone, they said over late coffees and unfriendly pie. The wash would have held him like a bowl. The wind would make the rest look like forgetting. Deputy Kara Sloan did not reject the theory because it was cruel. She set it aside because it was lazy. The tent argued against it. So did the circle on the oilcloth map and the timestamp on a gas station receipt. Lost people do messy things. They leave a trace of doubt in their own rooms. They circle, they scatter, they drink more water than they meant to. Mason's room was tidy. The bedspread flat. The map unfolded to the exact place he went. The motel pen still warm from use when Irene found it. If he had walked into heat and vanished by mistake, the narrative would not feel so neat. She walked the path again from the tent to the wash, letting her boots fall where his might have. She paused where the shallow prints ended and the wind had polished the ground into one unhelpful sheet. She looked left and right, making herself notice nothing. Not the glint of mica, not the suggestion of a curve. The theory asked her to accept that a man had stepped away from his camp with a jacket folded and an air mattress sagging and then simply stopped mattering. The scene refused to support that. Inside the tent, she knelt on the butcher paper she had laid days before and inventoried the absence. No camera. No main pack. No phone. The jacket remained, which people do leave when they make a short visit to the wash. But the phone not returning to the tent meant something else. Mason carried an old flip model according to the motel log where he had written a contact number. Beatty's service bled into not much once you left town. Still, people carry phones as talismans even where they do not work. They take photos with them. They check time. They set alarms for nothing. The phone gone with the camera leaned her away from accident into choreography. She turned to the table the searchers had set up in the shade of the cruiser. On it, she lined the artifacts in an order that felt like a sentence. Motel pen. Oilcloth map in plastic. The notebook with the torn page. The grocery slip for 2 waters and 2 bars. The bottle cap with its faint crescent of a partial print. She added a small plastic bag only she could read, a snapped piece of black plastic shaped like a shallow hinge. She turned to the table the searchers had set up in the shade of the cruiser. On it, she lined the artifacts in an order that felt like a sentence. Motel pen. Oilcloth map in plastic. The notebook with the torn page. The grocery slip for 2 waters and 2 bars. The bottle cap with its faint crescent of a partial print. She added a small plastic bag only she could read, a snapped piece of black plastic shaped like a shallow hinge. It had come from 30 yards beyond the tent earlier that morning, where a sliver of plastic pretended to be part of a leaf. In her hand, brushed off and turned, it made a soft click when the hinge met itself. A battery door from a camera, small, rectangular, with a nub of spring beneath a latch. Not proof of ownership, too many cameras share the same language. But enough to say, something with a battery had been opened, and at least one piece of it went missing in the wrong place. She compared the hinge to the way the notebook's torn edge felt. A similar violence, subtle and domestic. Things taken in a hurry often leave their smallest bones behind. She bagged the hinge alone. She did not write camera on the label. She wrote possible battery cover and the coordinates and the hour as 11:20 a.m. She did not explain to herself why the time mattered. It always did. The outsider, the quiet observer threading weeks together, liked the neatness of the items but distrusted what neatness does. In cases that end, sequence leads to cause. In cases that remain open, sequence becomes a comfort. So the outsider walked the ground again with Kara, not to believe, but to keep belief from becoming a shortcut. Around noon, a volunteer called from the far side of the wash. He had found nothing, he said, and then added that he might have found something that was probably also nothing. Kara went. In the lee of a flat rock near a mesquite, a thin line ran across the stone, bright metal against dull. She touched it. The mark snagged her glove. It was shallow, only 3 inches long, roughly parallel to the ground. If a tripod leg had been dragged while folded, if metal had kissed stone in a hurry, it might make a sound like that and leave a memory like this. She took 2 photographs. The lens caught the fine bright slash and the notch at its end where the pressure had lifted. She wrote metal scrape, low angle, adjacent to mesquite. She did not write tripod. The desert already tried to feed her language. The heat inside the tent turned mean. Someone propped both flaps for circulation. The nylon walls sighed. A dragonfly worked the same route it had flown yesterday, like a small plane on an invisible schedule. Ranger Dale Kincaid shifted weight from heel to toe and back, which meant waiting had become its own job. 2 buzzards drew ovals high up where everyone could ignore them and no one did. The afternoon brought the theory back for another pass, because absence will always play both sides. A rancher pointed out that people sometimes walk into dry washes to find shade, then up the walls when shade moves, then lose the way back by feet. A firefighter said in plain voice that heat is a predator without a face, and sometimes we want a face too badly. Each argument made a kind of sense. Each failed when Kara put it next to the chipped plastic hinge and the bright scrape near the mesquite and the single shallow tire track from days earlier. She took the motel pen from its plastic sleeve and clicked it while she looked at the map through its bag. It did not write. The click felt like a made thing refusing to refill its purpose. She put it back and used her own marker to add something to her copy of the map that only she needed. Notations for the hour each item introduced itself. 10:45 for the receipt. 11:15 a.m. for the departing car. Afternoon for the first sighting of a pickup at 4 p.m., according to Cody. Morning for the tent discovery. Late morning for the hinge. Late morning to midday for the scrape. She drew thin arrows as if time could be corralled onto paper with oil in its fibers. The map, once navigational, had become a rhythm diagram. That worried her. Rhythm is the drug the Unsolved administer to themselves. She called the substation to confirm they would pull phone company records for any weak pings. The tech on duty said he would try, but towers in that direction were stingy with proof. Sometimes he could get a last registration at the South Tower in town around 4 p.m. on the day of disappearance, sometimes the database acted like it had never known that particular phone. He promised nothing. She thanked him for the honesty. At 3 p.m., wind woke and scraped everything sideways. Flags leaned. The tent shuddered. Sand lifted and diffused the edges of shadows until even a footprint only minutes old read as rumor. The volunteers tightened their hatbands and went on reading ground because stopping would make all the explanations worse. Kara returned to the spot near the mesquite where the scrape marked the stone. She knelt and placed her hand just above it, close enough to feel the rock's heat, not close enough to lie to herself about what she was doing. She built a scene from geometry only, a tripod leg thunking once, a quick hand collecting loose parts, the decision to move a camera rather than leave it for a man to return to. She let the scene stop before deciding who the hand belonged to. Deciding too early turns investigators into authors. She needed to remain a reader. The light turned syrupy, thickening without softening. The ridge above them cast a shadow that lay gently over the wash without offering comfort. Kincaid called the day at 4 p.m., not because anything had told him to, but because work needs a line to step over so it stays work. The volunteers filed back, sunburnt and quiet. Someone said he'd bring a drone tomer. The seventh day began with a lead as thin as a sand-drifted track. A garage owner on the far edge of Beatty had remembered something. A pale pickup, older model, brought in just the week before to have all-terrain tires fitted. Paid cash. No name on the slip. The man behind the counter, Evan Pike, said he thought the driver wore a sun-faded cap, brim pulled low, and kept looking at the yard instead of the work being done. Deputy Kara Sloan wrote it down without writing more than what she heard. Memory was fragile currency. Still, Pike's description folded neatly into the outline Cody Bell had already offered, a pale truck idling near the wash around 4 p.m. on the day Mason vanished. Both accounts leaned toward the same shadow. In the garage, the smell of rubber was sharp enough to sting. Sloan studied the invoice, 4 tires, no brand loyalty, no address, just cash. The tread pattern shown on the catalog looked blocky, deep enough to leave the same kind of bite she'd seen in sand near the tent. She asked Pike about dirt residue. He shrugged. Said every truck came in with dirt. But he did remember knocking a reddish crust from the grooves before seating the tires. Red soil. Different from the pale talc of the Nevada flats. Later that afternoon, Sloan drove the long way out of town to test the thought. She knew where the nearest red earth lay. It was miles off, near a broken-down water tower and a scatter of mining shacks long since stripped of doors. She parked, stepped out, and let her boots grind the dust. It clung differently. Heavier. Rust-colored. If someone had been working in this zone, the residue would travel with them, pressed into tires like signatures. The outsider voice, methodical, uninvested, observing from a distance, threaded these pieces together without rushing. A tent in the wash. A drag line. A glass shard. A battery cover. A scrape of tripod metal. And now, a garage receipt with cash and no name, pointing toward soil from miles away. None of it made an arrest. All of it made a pattern. By early evening, Sloane met again with Cody Bell. He sat on the scrapyard steps, nursing a warm soda. She pressed him gently for more about the pickup. Cody scratched his beard, stared at the horizon, then said he remembered the truck had something hanging from the rearview mirror, a strip of cloth, faded, whipping in the heat breeze when the door opened. He wouldn't swear to it. Memory could be a liar. But he swore it wasn't a tourist's vehicle. Tourists keep the engine running for air, he said. This one didn't. Back at the substation, Sloane spread the oilcloth map again. The circle Mason had drawn, the arrow she'd added earlier, now stretched further. She drew a faint line to the red soil district. Her marker squeaked on the plastic sleeve, too loud in the quiet room. It looked like a reach, a guess, but geography has ways of guiding predators. Ground tells hunters where prey might not see them. On her desk, the motel pen lay sealed and silent. Its ink had long dried, but she still found herself turning the evidence bag under the lamp. A man had signed a register with it, circled a wash with it, left it behind as though the pen itself had gone off duty. Now it was her companion, inert but necessary. When the sun lowered, Sloane drove back to the tent site. She walked the perimeter one more time. The drag marks still visible in her memory, if not in the sand. She crouched by the partial tire impression, the one now blurred nearly flat by wind. She compared it in her mind to the tread blocks from Pike's catalog. They could fit. They might not. But the desert kept offering her these near mirrors, never exact, always possible. As twilight pulled across the ridges, she heard only the hum of insects and the faint groan of trucks on the highway far off. She stood at the wash, map folded under her arm, and felt the geography pressing in. Whoever moved in this ground had chosen their angles well. The tent had been seen. The man inside had not. The oilcloth map lay sealed, now marked with a new dark line pointing nowhere certain. The arrow ended in a blank white space. By the 8th morning, the search had begun to feel less like rescue and more like ritual. Crews fanned out across the ridge lines again, this time armed with metal detectors, drones, and more flags. The desert watched without blinking. The tent still sagged near the wash, door half open, the fabric whispering against itself. The outsider eye recorded the rhythm, trucks parked in a row, volunteers unfolding folding chairs, thermoses rattling with melted ice, radios crackling with grid assignments. At 9 a.m., Ranger Dale Kincaid read out the sectors like a teacher assigning homework. The heat was already climbing into triple digits, promising the kind of afternoon where mistakes multiply. Deputy Kara Sloane took the south flank, sweeping ground where the drag line had suggested something pulled away. She found nothing at first, just animal scat, pebbled dry and pale. Then, beneath an outcrop of volcanic rock, her boot dislodged a scatter of darkened soil. She knelt, brushed it back. The ground revealed a circular patch, darker than the sand around it, flecked with ash. She called Kincaid over. Together they crouched at the site, the air around them suddenly holding its breath. It was a fire ring once, or something close. The stones had collapsed, scattered, but the mark was clear, ash where ash did not belong, compacted by heat. Sloane pulled a small vial from her kit and pinched a sample. It smelled faintly chemical, as if something more than wood had burned. A trace of petroleum maybe, or oil soaked into tinder. Among the ash, she saw two warped objects, one the twisted remnant of a tent stake, the other a blob of melted plastic, blackened and fused into a shape no longer recognizable. She bagged both. The volunteers clustered, eyes wide. Someone asked if the fire had been for warmth. Sloane shook her head. Nobody burned fires in September heat. This was disposal. As the day stretched, more fragments emerged. One searcher found a single button half melted. Another turned up a corner of foil stamped with faint lettering. Nothing conclusive. Each piece whispered the same suggestion: someone had tried to erase, but not carefully enough. By noon the temperature climbed to 107. The volunteers retreated to trucks for shade, leaving the site marked with flags. Sloane walked the perimeter alone. She noted how the fire pit sat just within sight of the ridge, invisible from the highway, invisible from the tent unless someone climbed higher ground. That vantage point again, the predator's balcony. She pulled out the oilcloth map from her case file copy. The circle Mason had drawn. The arrow she'd added. She traced a new line, pencil this time, toward the coordinates of the fire pit. It fell neatly along the geometry, turning the map into a diagram of intent rather than chance. The grease-stained fold seemed darker under the sun, like it absorbed more than oil. The motel pen remained in its evidence bag, useless, but Kara touched it anyway. She remembered the ink blot that had stopped mid-line, as if Mason had been interrupted while writing. Now she wondered if the interruption had stretched across miles. Kincaid returned with a report from one of the volunteers who had used a metal detector along the wash. Nothing large, but small tones here and there. He'd dug up 2 rusted nails, a pull tab from a soda can, and a piece of wire bent like it had been cut with pliers. They logged it all, even the trash. In open cases, trash sometimes reintroduces itself years later as artifact. The outsider narration lingered on the strangeness of this: a camp set with order, a drag line erased by wind, and now a fire pit tucked against stone, where plastic had surrendered its shape. Every clue seemed to echo a hand behind it, one that preferred control to chaos. Accidents do not build fire rings. Accidents do not melt plastic stakes. As shadows lengthened, a storm front teased the horizon, low clouds smudging the ridges purple. Lightning cracked far off, too distant to save or ruin evidence, but close enough to remind everyone how quickly desert changes sides. If rain came, the ash would smear into mud, the fragments scattered in slurry. Sloane photographed everything twice, as if pictures could hold more than the ground wanted to give. By 4 p.m., the crew packed up. The storm veered north. The fire pit remained, flags trembling beside it, the ash cooling though no fire had burned there in days. The desert had revealed not where Mason was, but where someone else had stood, making decisions in heat and shadow. A pile of ash held secrets no flame should leave. The storm came in the night, one of those desert tempests that arrived without ceremony. Wind lashed grit into the air, lightning crawled sideways across the sky, and for 20 minutes hard rain battered the wash. By morning the air was washed clean, cooler, the ridges sharp as cut glass. Searchers returned to a world rearranged. Tracks erased. Loose debris carried yards from where it had been. The tent sagged heavier, nylon darkened, as though it too had taken on water. Deputy Kara Sloane welcomed the storm more than she feared it. Rain was a thief, yes, but sometimes it gave in return. She walked the wash with careful steps, boots sinking into soft mud where yesterday had been powder. Along the bend of a mesquite root, she saw it, a strap half buried, edges swollen from moisture. She knelt, pulled it gently. A camera strap. Black nylon, cracked at the edges, one brass clip still attached. The other end was frayed, cut clean on one side, as though sliced by a sharp edge. Sloane held it in her gloved palm. The desert had hidden it until water changed the weight of things. Now the strap surfaced, like a sentence fragment after years of silence. She bagged it, tagged the time, 9:15 a.m., and walked the length of the wash for more. She found no camera, no lens, just that lone strap, limp and accusatory. Around her, volunteers marked other rain gifts, a tin can exposed, a shard of colored glass, 2 pebbles washed bright from beneath layers of dust. Nothing else belonged to Mason. Nothing else carried his weight. The outsider voice traced the geometry: tent, drag line, fire pit, now camera strap. A sequence where every new piece widened the distance between accident and intent. Sloane studied the strap again under shade. The fray wasn't wear. It was violence. Threads snapped evenly, not over time, but in one moment of pressure. She pressed the fabric between her fingers. It held the shape of something once trusted to carry. Later, back in town, she logged the strap into evidence. She placed it next to the motel pen, the oilcloth map, the torn notebook, the partial fingerprint, the plastic battery cover, the tripod scrape, the melted steak. The shelf now looked less like random salvage and more like an outline of resistance. At the diner, Irene Voigt poured coffee for truckers and tourists, her hands slow, her eyes wandering to the photocopied map under the counter. When asked about the missing man, she repeated the story in fewer words each time. The circle on the map had become a burn mark in her memory, and she no longer needed to unfold the copy to see it. Cody Bell drifted into town that afternoon, his shirt damp from rain, eyes sharper than usual. He mentioned hearing a noise weeks earlier, before anyone noticed Mason gone. A heavy thud, he said, out by the wash one night. Not thunder, not a gunshot, but a weight dropped against earth. No one believed him then. He hadn't told anyone. Now he told Sloane because storms make people remember. She wrote it down. A noise. A thud. No proof. Just sound suspended in memory. As evening came, the desert looked scrubbed, colors deeper, shadows precise. The tent, soaked and heavy, sagged like a skin without bone. Sloane stood at its entrance, watching water drip from the flap. The strap lay safe in her cruiser, but its echo hung here, among the rocks and roots. A man had carried a camera into the desert. The camera was gone. The strap remained. The motel pen, useless in its sleeve, seemed suddenly louder on the shelf, its ink blot like a cut-off line. The oilcloth map, circled in black, seemed less a plan and more a warning. Rain had cleared the dust but left no answers. Only more reasons to distrust silence. The strap hung in her mind like a question that cut clean. The red dirt district lay east of the highway, where old shacks collapsed inward and a water tower leaned like a tired sentry. The soil itself announced the place, iron-rich, rust-dark, clinging to boots with a stubbornness the pale desert never learned. Deputy Kara Sloane let her cruiser idle a moment, windows down, listening for the language of scrap. Metal has its own voices, the dull argument of sheet against sheet, the sharp cry of a pry bar, the ringing memory of things that used to work. The yard belonged to Ruthie Calder, a woman who kept her gray hair tied in a bandana and her ledgers in pencil. The office smelled of oil and cigarettes, the fan above the desk turning with a patience that made other machines look anxious. Sloane showed her badge and the map copy. Ruthie squinted at the circle and then at the thin line Sloane had drawn from it to this district. "Folks bring me everything," Ruthie said. "Mostly nothing." She tapped the ledger. "But some nothings rhyme." Out back, the yard opened into lanes of salvage. Rusted stoves. Wire spools. Frames without bodies. The red dirt held all of it in a loose embrace, powdering every edge the same color. Sloane walked those lanes with the same rhythm she used at the tent, slow, observant, respectful of the way chaos organizes itself. "Had a guy last week," Ruthie called from behind her. "Dropped a bundle of camping stuff. Cheap. Said his brother left it to him and he was cleaning out. I didn't ask where." "What kind of stuff?" Sloane asked. "Odds and ends. Chair. Some bent stakes. A bottle. A busted camera stand leg, I think. I kept the bottle to hold bolts. The rest's over there." They turned down a lane stacked with toolboxes. Ruthie knelt beside a low bin and plucked out a metal water bottle the color of tarnished sky. Its paint had been scraped to islands. Sloane turned it in her hands. The cap squeaked. Inside, the smell wasn't rot. It was mineral, flat, clean, almost medicinal. She tilted the bottle and watched a pale powder cling to the seam where water once dried. The residue made the metal taste in the air. She bagged the bottle and wrote a time, then the simplest description. A few yards away, under a battered tailgate, lay the tripod leg. It was snapped near the first lock, the brake bright under the rust, as if force had been recent. Sloane felt the weight of it. She looked for a maker's mark and found only a ghost of letters, rubbed thin by use, as unhelpful as a name whispered in wind. She bagged it separately, careful with the jagged end that had once met stone. Ruthie stood with her hands on her hips. "People bring trash by the mile," she said. "They don't usually bring parts with fresh edges. Fresh edges mean argument, not age." Sloane nodded. She didn't say what the red dirt said to her, that any vehicle in this yard would carry the soil with it, would leave it in tire grooves and floor mats and cuffs of pants. She didn't say how Cody's memory of a pale pickup with its engine off had started to breathe again when she saw the tripod leg. She let the yard speak in metal because metal told the truth at human speed. In the office, Ruthie flipped pages until she found the entry she wanted, a line in pencil, no name, a date that sat like a stone. "Guy paid in cash," she said. "Wore a cap. Didn't waste words. Brought the lot in one trip." "Did you notice his truck?" Sloane asked. "Light-colored. Bleached. Not new. That's all I've got." Sloane let the information be exactly as small as it was. She asked to buy the bottle and the broken leg. Ruthie waved a hand and named a price in words instead of numbers, then shook her head and told Sloane to take them for the story, which had more value than money here anyway. Back at the substation, Sloane set the bottle on the evidence table. She unscrewed the cap and tapped the rim with her fingernail. A trace of powder held on. She dabbed it with a swab, then stopped herself from calling it anything. Doubt protected the work. She wrote the location, the time, and the word residue, then closed the bag with a soft press. The tripod leg came next. She wiped the rust dust from the faint letters and got a shape, if not a full name. It was enough to check catalogs, to call 3 small camera shops within 100 miles. The third one, a place that still sold film and knew customers by face, put her on hold long enough to make her think the line had died. Then a clerk came back with a breathless sort of triumph. "We sold a tripod like that 2 summers ago," he said. "We keep a card file for repairs. If the lock snapped once, we write it down. Don't ask me why. Owner wanted a replacement part but ended up buying a new one. Paid in cash. We still stamped the card." "Do you have a serial stub?" Sloane asked. "We have a short code from the packaging," he said. "It doesn't mean much on its own." "It means enough," she said, and thanked him. She didn't write the store's name into a place where it would sound like an accusation. She made a note in her own hand and kept the page behind the oilcloth map. The outsider voice paused there, as if to remind anyone listening that this wasn't proof. It was a rhyme, like Ruthie had said. But certain rhymes carry the shape of a face behind them, and the case had moved close enough to see features without claiming a portrait. Evening took its time. Sloane stood by the shelf, watching the story stack itself: motel pen, oilcloth map, torn notebook, bottle cap with partial, camera strap, plastic battery door, tripod scrape near mesquite, melted tent stake, red dirt bottle, broken tripod leg. A grammar had formed without permission. She resisted writing a paragraph. She stayed with the list. She drove back to the yard before the light failed. Ruthie met her at the gate with a rag in one hand and a coffee in the other. "Got to thinking," she said. "The man who brought the camping stuff, he had a way of standing. The kind where feet point out a little. Like his boots were telling on his knees." Sloane felt the small click of a detail fitting a groove, prints from the ridge, toe out, heavy. Not a match, not even a promise, but a line that ran in parallel. She thanked Ruthie and wrote it down, careful to keep the words as small as the memory that made them. On the way out, she walked the lane again, looking for the thing she had missed. That's how late-day searches go, you look for the absence you failed to notice in the morning. By the fence, a nail bucket had been set on the ground, leaving a ring of clean red where it sat. The ring made the dirt around it look older, like time had a direction here. She thought of the fire ring above the wash and how ash told on intent even when stone wouldn't. The highway pulled her back toward the tent with its usual parable, distance is not an argument, only a measurement. The wind blew head-on and rocked the cruiser, lifting plumes of dust that refused to commit to one direction. She passed the water tower and the shacks without counting them, as if naming might make them witnesses and witnesses might decide to sleep. At the sight, the tent waited with the patience of fabric. The flap moved but never waved, nylon doesn't perform. Sloane walked to the wash and looked down where rain had carved a fresh lip. Summer storms recut the same lines, sometimes deeper, sometimes in a new stubbornness. She wondered how many times the ground had been asked to hold contradictions like this and how often it had agreed. Her copy of the oilcloth map had gained a new pencil mark for the yard. Under a fluorescent lamp later, that line would look inevitable, a trick of after-the-fact symmetry. Out here, it felt like nothing more than a line drawn by a tired hand to stitch one weight of soil to another. She sat on her bumper and let the evening settle. The motel pen lay on the seat beside her in its clouded sleeve, lighter than it looked. It had signed a register, circled a wash, and then gone inert. Objects grow into larger lives when humans retreat. The pen had become a metronome for absence. The map had become the hymnbook. Out past the ridge, a truck crawled along the highway, throwing a slow ribbon of light that never quite reached the wash. Somewhere behind her, the yard kept its red dust and the broken leg pointed at nothing but the sky. She had begun to understand that in this case, nothing was often a kind of arrow. The tripod's brake gleamed like a fresh tooth in rust. Years slid by like dust across glass. The motel changed its curtains. The gas station changed its ice supplier. Search teams aged, retired, or moved on to other grids. But the tent remained in memory, standing in a wash that by now had collapsed in storms and filled again with silence. Mason Reed's family sent letters every season, pleas, photographs, requests for updates, and the responses returned thinner each time. Deputy Kara Sloane, now older and marked by the case she never signed off, kept the file in a lower cabinet she opened more often than she admitted. She still had the oilcloth map pressed between sheets of plastic. The circle Mason had drawn in 2006 was bold as ever. Around it, her own pencil notations had grown into a spidery web, coordinates of a fire pit, spot of a drag line, place of a scrape, location of red soil. The web resembled something designed rather than discovered. In the evidence box, the motel pen slept. It was cracked along the barrel now, ink dried long ago. Sloane lifted it sometimes, imagining Mason signing his name, clicking the point, circling that wash. She returned it gently, as if rough handling might make the silence louder. The case files contained the usual routine of dead ends, lab results marked inconclusive, interviews marked insufficient, photographs that showed more sand than object. But every few years a small piece surfaced. A hiker turned in a weathered boot lace found miles away. A rancher submitted a bone that proved to be cow. A tourist thought she saw a pale pickup with the same tilt Cody once described. None of it locked to Mason. Yet the fragments whispered a pattern, the kind predators leave when they prefer routine to chaos. In 2010, Mason's sister mailed the sheriff's office a warranty card she had found among his old papers. It bore the serial stub of a camera tripod purchased the summer before his disappearance. The number was faint, smudged by years in a drawer, but legible. Sloane compared it to the partial code recovered from the broken tripod leg Ruthie Calder had shown her. They rhymed. Not exact. Never exact. But enough to suggest the broken leg had once belonged to Mason's gear. The connection tightened the net without catching anything. By 2013, digital archives had replaced most paper. But Sloane kept the map and pen in physical form. Evidence has weight, she explained once. Screens don't. She taped copies of tire tread comparisons beside the map, the black block pattern bleeding across white pages like scars. She highlighted the day and hour of every sighting: 10:45 a.m. receipt, 11:15 a.m. car leaving, 4 p.m. pale pickup, the storm rain that gave up a strap. The timeline became less a calendar and more a cadence. The outsider voice, cold, patient, saw the file as a machine made of absence. Each cog was an artifact that turned another without producing motion. Yet when the gears aligned, they pointed to a single geometry: a man camped where he should have been safe, a hunter chose ground that made him invisible, and afterward objects trickled back in fragments, as if spat out by the desert with reluctant hands. Sloane sometimes traced her finger along the oilcloth map's grease-stained crease. The stain had darkened over years, eating deeper into the fibers. It looked like a scar that widened instead of healed. She remembered Irene Voigt keeping a photocopy behind the counter, tapping the circle absent-mindedly. She remembered Cody's low voice about hunters who didn't hunt animals. She remembered Ruthie's observation of a man's toe-out stance. Each detail seemed minor. Together they sang the same thin song. The file now contained one digital gift, a weak tower ping logged by a technician who dug old carrier data. It placed Mason's phone alive at 4 p.m. on the day he disappeared, barely registering on a southern tower before dropping into silence forever. The timing was cruel, it coincided with Cody's sighting of the pale pickup near the wash. Technology had finally agreed with rumor, but too late to seize a hand. The outsider catalogued what this meant: the last verifiable mark of Mason alive was not his room, not his tent, but a weak signal gasping across miles of empty air. The desert had offered one electric heartbeat, then closed its fist. By 2016, the case was called cold in official language, but Sloane knew that meant only that the file joined others on the same shelf. She pinned the map above her desk anyway, where its circle glowed under lamplight like a wound. She tacked the motel pen's photograph beside it, the ink blot forever mid-pool. She studied them as if objects could speak across years. And she saw a truth most files hide: predators pick places that cooperate. Mason Reed had not chosen wrongly. Someone else had chosen better. The geometry held. The circle, the drag line, the fire pit, the strap, the tripod leg, the tire tread, the red dust. Each was a point on a net. A net with no name. The map looked less like evidence and more like a trap sketched in ink. Lines on the map converged into the shape of a snare. The file reopened briefly in 2021 when a new task force combed through unsolved cases across the county. Fresh eyes, they called it. Fresh eyes on old dust. They pulled Mason Reed's box down from the shelf and set it on a metal table in a borrowed conference room. The air smelled of copier ink and faint bleach, as if the room tried to stay impartial. On the table lay the oilcloth map, sealed in its mylar sleeve. The black circle Mason had drawn 15 years earlier still pressed through, bold against terrain that had long since shifted in real life. Along its edges, Kara Sloane's penciled coordinates turned the map into something more than a traveler's tool. It had become a diagram of an ambush: tent, ridge, wash, fire pit, scrap yard. Every line suggested the hand of someone who knew how to make geography obey. Beside it, in another sleeve, the motel pen. Barrel cracked, ink dry, logo faded. It had begun life as the cheapest of objects, meant to be discarded or stolen by forgetful guests. Now it sat under fluorescent light as a formal exhibit, logged with a chain of custody sheet thick enough to feel permanent. It was the one object that connected lobby to desert, signature to circle, life to absence. The task force reviewed the evidence with professional detachment. The melted tent stake. The broken tripod leg. The camera strap cut clean. The partial print lifted from a bottle cap. The smear of gear oil. The reflective glass shard. Each was weighed again, measured again, then logged back into silence. The report concluded what the desert had already declared: no suspects, no charges, no closure. The outsider voice noted the ritual: papers shuffled, conclusions written, file resealed. Objects returned to plastic. But the geometry of the case remained, invisible to any form but memory. A man camped alone. A predator chose ground above him. Objects were left like crumbs that led only into wind. Irene Voigt retired from the dusty spur. She carried the photocopy of the map with her in a drawer. Alma Ruiz kept the memory of Mason's question about water, repeating it when strangers asked about the desert. Cody Bell drifted on, muttering still about hunters without prey. Ruthie Calder's yard filled with more scrap, the red dust powdering everything the same. And Sloane, no longer in uniform, kept her own copy of the map folded in a file at home. Some nights she laid it out under a lamp, tracing the circle, the arrow, the lines. She knew it was not resolution she was looking for, but rhythm. The case had become her metronome. In the sheriff's archive, the official file was slid into its drawer. The label read, "Unsolved." The pen and map remained inside, side by side, separated from the world by clear plastic and manila. Their silence was the loudest evidence left. Out in the desert, the wash lay empty. The tent had long since been removed, the drag line erased, the fire pit scattered by storms. Only the geography endured: ridge, pocket, basin, highway. A place still able to hide a hunter, still able to swallow a traveler, still able to keep its agreement with silence. The last image in the file was a photograph enlarged to near useless grain, a tire impression half blurred by wind, cutting across the ghost of a boot print. The caption read only, "Undetermined." The case ended not with names, but with objects. A map with grease in its fold. A pen that ran out mid-line. Both sealed away, waiting for hands that might never open them again. The desert kept its promise.